Welcome to the Media Storm studio. Our guest today is an author, global expert in corruption in the arms trade, and former South African politician. The son of a Holocaust survivor, he was the first MP to introduce a motion on the Holocaust in the South African Parliament, where he served in the country's post-apartheid government as a member of Nelson Mandela's ANC. For the second time, welcome to Media Storm, Andrew Feinstein.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
That is a hell of a CV. Can I just say?
Yeah.
Do you ever hear it and just think, yeah, all right?
You know what? Not at all. Because, and I was talking to someone about this the other day, it just happened to be where I was at a particular time in my life. And I was a very political person. And when you're in that moment, you don't realize what you're involved in. And it's only sort of subsequently when I refer to Nelson Mandela as my former boss, and people sort of jaws drop, that I think, oh my gosh.
Yeah. You never know when history happens.
Exactly. And I think it's a function of circumstance. I mean, obviously, I'd been involved in the struggle against apartheid, and I'd had to leave the country in 1986 at very short notice. And if anyone had said to me, oh, don't worry, because, in 8 years' time, you'll be a member of parliament, we'll be in government, etc., I would have offered them a straitjacket.
I mean, at that time, was the party that you were part of even, was it still seen as a terrorist organization?
Of course.
Yeah.
It was regarded as a terrorist organization. Nelson Mandela was described by both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as a terrorist. In fact, Thatcher privately encouraged the apartheid state to have Mandela killed in jail because she thought it was too dangerous to keep him alive.
Ooh, there's the first scoop of the episode. Honestly,
Wow.
we could and we should at some point do a whole episode. Actually, really
Absolutely. No, I'd love to.
But all of this will inform, I think, what we're going to talk about today, which is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is, of course, in today's political climate, quite a divisive and explosive subject, but it shouldn't be. It's racism, discrimination, hate, and it's on the rise.
From January to June 2024, the British charity Community Security Trust recorded reports of 1,978 anti-Jewish hate incidents, up from 964 in the first half of 2023. That's a rise in line with the police statistics we shared in the intro. And the report relies on self-reported incidents, so the likelihood is it's a shy estimate. Andrew, most of us don't see discrimination that doesn't happen to us. So could you just share with us, what does anti-Semitism look like in the UK today?
I'm going to start a bit earlier. My own experience of anti-Semitism. I'm Jewish and very proudly Jewish. And when I was growing up in apartheid South Africa, a state run by avowed neo-Nazis, I'll never forget my mom would take us to football practice in her little old Mini, me and a few friends. And one day there were too many of us to get into the car. And one of the guys just sort of dropped a little thought. How do you get 12 Jews into a Mini? You put a half-cent piece on the back seat. Okay. And I didn't fully understand it at the time. I think I was 9. And my mom just exploded, which was very unlike her. And afterwards, I sort of asked her, and she explained to me that anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews as Jews, and that this was an example because it assumed we were all money-grubbing, awful people. And it's this notion that all Jews think with one mind, that all Jews are alike, etc., etc. So anti-Semitism is something that I've obviously experienced myself, as have most Jews. It's something that was a huge part of my growing up because my mom was a Holocaust survivor. In Britain today, I think we importantly need to put it in context. One incident of anti-Semitism is one incident too much, because as you say, this is a form of racism. It's a vile form of racism. But we also shouldn't get obsessed by just one form of racism. So we have to consider anti-Semitism in the context, particularly at the moment, because of what is happening in Israel-Palestine, of Islamophobia at the same time. There has definitely been an increase in anti-Semitism over the last couple of years in Britain, which is horrific. At the same time, there's been an even larger increase in Islamophobia. And we need to be aware of that, because as Nelson Mandela used to say, You are either against each and every form of racism or you're part of the racism problem. And I think it's important for us to understand that being the victim of racism and abuse isn't a competition. And sometimes when we think that anti-Semitism should be treated as exceptional and it's more important than Islamophobia or anti-black racism or whatever else, I think we get ourselves caught up in problems. But there is no doubt that it is rising. Now, we're not sure from the CST methodology exactly what they define as anti-Semitism. And given that they use the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is quite problematic, we need to be aware of these things. Why? Because they might equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Right.
Now, there are many anti-Zionist Jews. Anti-Zionism was a creation of Jewish intellectuals, as was Zionism. And so some people would argue that anti-Zionism can be, but is not necessarily, anti-Semitism. So we just need to be a bit cautious of those sorts of things. At the same time, we need to, without any hesitation, call out any manifestation of racism, of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia, of anti-black racism, or any form of discrimination. And there is no doubt that all of these things are on the rise in our society, in the UK, and in the world. And that's partly, in my opinion, a function of our politics having moved so far to the right, of racist politicians becoming completely mainstreamed, that a lot of people feel enabled to give expression to what are vile racist thoughts.
Absolutely. And we're definitely going to get into that more now. I wonder if quickly for our listeners, you can describe the difference or just define for us Zionism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, what you mean by those terms.
Sure.
Just in case people don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good idea. So Zionism is a political ideology, a school of political thought that was developed by a group of Jewish intellectuals, and we would call them now activists, who believed that for the protection of the Jewish people, who of course had suffered thousands of years of pogroms, of abuse, of anti-Semitism, the solution to this was to create a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland. And there were many places that were suggested as a possible site for this, including, and again I can't remember exactly, it might have been Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa, and various others. So Zionism is a political ideology that believes that the only way to protect Jewish people, or the best way to protect Jewish people, is by having a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state, which is what the state of Israel is today. Anti-Zionism, which interestingly at the time that Zionism was developed, was also developed by Jewish intellectuals and what we would today call activists. But it had exactly the opposite view. It was an ideology that believed that creating a Jewish state or a Jewish homeland, in fact, undermined the safety of Jewish people and made them even more of a target. And they were therefore anti-Zionist. Right. Now, there was nothing about anti-Zionism that was in any way anti-Semitic. These were all Jewish intellectuals. So because of current political ideology and thinking, where the state of Israel tries to insulate itself from any criticism, there has been an attempt by arms of the Israeli state, by supporters of the Israeli state, to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which clearly, when you look at its origins and you look at the fact that today, even in Israel, there are tens of thousands of Jewish Israelis who are anti-Zionist, who live in a state that they don't believe should exist as a purely Jewish state. They believe that it should be a completely democratic state where every citizen is treated equally before the law. And then, as against that, as I mentioned earlier, anti-Semitism, and we need to understand it very simply. There's no need to try and make complex what is a very simple concept. Anti-Semitism is a hatred of Jews as Jews. And therefore, in my opinion, to equate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is incredibly dangerous. Of course, anti-Zionism can be used to be anti-Semitic. But to then draw from that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, given that many Jews are anti-Zionist, is obviously an absurdity.
Now, I think that false equivalence between anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism is going to be a big theme in this discussion. And the first place we like to look here at Media Storm is, of course, the media.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at some recent media mishaps in spotlighting and calling out anti-Semitism. Now, when the first Free Palestine Solidarity or ceasefire marches began happening in London and across the UK, there was a lot of misinformation about the nature of the marches. Misinformation that was either started by or spread by the media. Towards the end of 2023, then Home Secretary Suella Braverman described the demonstrators as being involved in hate marches. She said tens of thousands of people had taken to the streets and had chanted for the erasure of Israel from the map.
Now, crucially, there have been some displays of anti-Semitism by individuals and groups attending these rallies. These people are neither associated with the organisers, nor are they championing the cause for which these marches are organised, but they should be identified and penalised. Thing is, they should be called for what they are, not pro-ceasefire or pro-Palestine solidarity campaigners, but racist anti-Semites. Conflating them with an entire popular cause, as you've described, not only serves a deeply political agenda, but is probably pretty panicking for people deemed at risk.
Just to give you a sense of this conflation, in March 2024, the previous government's counter-extremism commissioner, Robin Simcox, said London had become a no-go zone for Jews during the weekend ceasefire marches and wrote about an increase in extremist disruption in the Telegraph. March organisers made a point that many Jewish people attend the marches, a point that was often left out in media discussion. March organisers also placed blame back on ministers such as Robin Simcox for frightening the Jewish community. Andrew, you've attended the marches yourself. What have your experiences of the marches been like?
First of all, I have to preface what I say about the marches by saying I think in the world today, not just in Britain, the US particularly, but in the so-called Western world, what some people refer to as the global North, our politics are in crisis. Because of the amount of power involved in politics and the amount of money involved in politics now, it's essential that the most moral of people go into politics. But unfortunately, because of the economics of politics and the amount of power involved in politics, it is the least moral amongst us who go into politics. And I say this as what Al Gore would describe as a recovering politician. Now, the reality is, if we look at the so-called Western world, and, you mentioned Suella Braverman, it's extraordinary that someone who is so hate-filled every time they open their mouths is the person describing these marches as hate marches. But this is the reality of our politics. And unfortunately, part of the reason, in my opinion, that this has come about is because the media is no longer doing its job.
Yeah.
The media, unfortunately, has become a vessel for the trumpeting of a lot of the very and this is, I'm talking about the sort of what we'd refer to as the traditional or mainstream media, of the trumpeting of some of the worst excesses in our politics.
Exactly.
Rather than actually analysing them and critiquing them, they're simply trumpeting them. And unfortunately, this is largely across the board in the traditional media, which is why we've seen, thank goodness, the rise of alternative media and why so many people are getting so much of their news and information from podcasts, for instance, which I think is a great thing. So, to come back to the marches, I've spoken at marches, I've been involved with some of the organisers, some of whom are Jewish, by the way, the organisers themselves, let's not forget this. And I've marched. And they are the exact opposite of hate marches. There is a solidarity and a coming together of sentient human beings who feel for other human beings. And I'm not sure I found a space with so many people where you have such a wonderful atmosphere. And on some of the marches, because I cycle a lot, I cycle in and out of the marches so I can spend time with the Jewish bloc and with other blocs. There is a huge Jewish bloc on every march, which is a whole lot of Jews who are very critical of Israel and what is going on in the occupied territories, who march with pride as Jews. There are a number of Holocaust survivors amongst them. So I do not recognize this notion of hate-filled marches. And as I say, I think it comes largely from the hate that is consuming the people who enunciate these sorts of views.
Yeah, I spoke to Holocaust survivors at the marches. That's the only time I've ever spoken to them.
It's not hard when you're there to find, you know, many Jewish campaigners. And, you know, either the media is not even turning up to these rallies to fact check the hate that they are just regurgitating from politicians, you know, or they don't care to fact check it. And when we stir up fear indiscriminately, it makes it hard to, you know, identify the real causes for fear. And when we falsely use hate to diminish anything and anyone that doesn't agree with us, we often miss hate within our own ranks. Now, the kind of anti-Semitism that has occasionally appeared at, you know, these marches, for example, I mean, they often appear in every sector of society, including most of the political parties, you know, condemning these marches for it. And also by some of the most influential and powerful individuals in our society. Now, sadly, there is no shortage of examples of this in recent headlines, examples of people with extreme power demonstrating anti-Semitism, and chunks of the media have been accused of downplaying it when it is powerful people.
One example, of course, is Elon Musk and his hotly contested salute. At an event following Trump's swearing in as US president, Musk twice made a gesture that appeared to be the Heil Hitler salute, banned for its Nazi links in Germany. I'm sure you've all seen the footage. The gesture was as much celebrated as a Nazi salute by white nationalists as it was condemned as one by anti-hate groups and, of course, political rivals. Musk later responded to criticisms of his behaviour on X, tweeting, "Frankly, they need better dirty tricks. The everyone is Hitler attack is so tired."
Firstly, I want to draw listeners' attention to something that may not have come onto their radar, but it came onto mine due to friends in South Africa. I used to work there. And I imagine it probably crossed your radar as well. Some South Africans recognise this salute instantly as one used in the context of apartheid by pro-Hitler, white supremacist, Afrikaner resistance movement. Now, South African-born Musk, of course, grew up in the context of apartheid. He has also repeatedly claimed that the country is now oppressing white people who, just for context, own 77% of the land in South Africa, despite being 7% of the population. Andrew, you grew up in apartheid South Africa, and you encountered firsthand the anti-Semitism that often went hand in hand with white supremacism. Did you happen to make this connection with the Musk salute?
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, Elon Musk is a creation of apartheid South Africa. He feels to me like a child of Hendrik Verwoerd, who was the racist Nazi who was the architect of apartheid after the Second World War. Elon Musk grew up in Pretoria, which was the sort of center of the apartheid state. He was English-speaking. He was rubbish at sport, where in South Africa under apartheid you had a hierarchy. Rugby first, racism second, religion third. Those were the shibboleths of our society. That is what drove apartheid South Africa. And Musk was rubbish at rugby. He was badly bullied at school. He was very bright. Do we, as the world today, have to live Elon Musk's trauma played out on the biggest public stages available to human beings? Because that is, to me, what feels like is happening. His family left apartheid South Africa when there was the first inkling we might become a democracy in which all were treated equally. In the first gigafactory of Tesla, gigafactories are these huge factories where the cars get made, there is an area where all black workers have to work that management refer to as the ghetto. There is an ongoing court case about this in the United States of America. This is a guy who has internalized racism to deal with his own insecurities growing up in a racist state. Now, anybody who thinks that that wasn't a Nazi salute should just be aware of the reality that 2 days later, Elon Musk appeared as the keynote speaker of the neo-Nazi far right-wing German movement, the AfD. Just in case anybody had missed the significance of doing the Nazi salute.
This is the thing. The main media debate that followed the salute was whether or not it was a salute, rather than an intricate looking at Elon Musk's ties to the far right. It's not just the Nazi salute that has shown us that Musk is anti-Semitic and racist.
The real life impact that this can have on people, on Jewish people who are living in a society where neo-Nazi views, Nazi views are being normalised. A second recent example of very high-profile anti-Semitism lately has been Kanye West, who shockingly ran an ad during the Super Bowl, right, which means it was aired nationally across Fox TV stations. And this ad directed people to a website where they would find one item on sale, a swastika T-shirt listed HH01, HH, an acronym signifying Heil Hitler. And now, once again, as with Musk, many media rushed to diminish industry responsibility in facilitating his disgusting stunt. Variety reported that his ad couldn't have set off any red flags at the time because, at the time, the swastika shirt wasn't listed on the website. The Fox CEO emailed all staff saying the advert was, quote, completely outside of our station's control. And yet, West has repeatedly, publicly proclaimed himself to be a Nazi. Weeks before the ad, he went on a multi-day anti-Semitic rant on X. He wrote, I love Hitler, now what? He wrote, tellingly, Elon stole my Nazi swag. A couple of years ago, he was literally banned from Instagram and X for anti-Semitic comments. Musk brought him back. He has since had to remove him again. West has a social media following of more than 31 million people. What is the impact of global celebrities displaying attitudes like this with practical media, public, political impunity, on real people?
The impact of this is terrifying because impressionable, young predominantly, but not exclusively people, will see this and think it's actually okay for me to behave like a Nazi. And let's just bear in mind how Nazis behave. They slaughtered 12 million people, 6 million of whom were Jewish, and they were slaughtered because they were Jewish. 6 million of whom were slaughtered because they were either gay or queer, because they were physically or mentally impaired in some way, because they were travelers, because they were socialists or communists. So the fact that somebody is allowed to use platforms like X, which of course is owned and abused by Elon Musk, should be illegal. Its impact on our society is terrifying. And I fear that unless we do something about it, people are going to die as a consequence of this sort of complete insanity from people like Kanye West and Elon Musk. And this is where we go from the territory of being angry about this to being deeply, deeply concerned about what the actual consequences might be. And unfortunately, our politicians and our media, again, are responsible for this because they make big stories out of all of this insanity. And it starts with my own Member of Parliament, Keir Starmer, who has aided, abetted, enabled and facilitated racism during the election campaign. Keir Starmer, who claims to have once been a human rights lawyer, who at the time was leader of the Labour Party, which is supposed to be a slightly more progressive party than the parties of the Suella Bravermans of this world, says people who arrived in this country on boats, he's referring to refugees, to people who are in the worst conditions of their lives, who are fleeing conflicts that Britain is often enabling and profiting from through the sale of weaponry. This is the level of our political discourse in this country. What this is incitement to hatred and disunity. And all of our mainstream politicians are using it in order to further their political careers. And it disgusts me.
I couldn't agree with you more that Labour's like theatre around punishing refugees who have fled war via the only routes available to them, routes which happen to be illegal because the last Conservative government criminalised them. I think that is straight out of the Nazi playbook. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
Absolutely, I would agree with you entirely. And we should remember that Keir Starmer weaponized anti-Semitism to become leader of the Labour Party. They took probably the most anti-racist member of Parliament in the British Parliament, and they labelled him an anti-Semite. Now, obviously, I'm talking about Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn is someone I've known for decades through his involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle and his international peace work. I don't mind what people think of Jeremy Corbyn. The point here is the double standards. And that today in the world, it is the anti-racists who are being called racist. And to a large extent, why that is happening and why anti-Semitism is at the front of that is unfortunately because of the State of Israel. Because the State of Israel today is prepared to label Jews who are not uncritical of the State of Israel as anti-Semites, which is an absurdity, while at the same time the State of Israel, amongst its closest relationships, are obviously with Donald Trump's administration, who has Elon Musk giving Nazi salutes at his inauguration, who has his supporters when they invade the Capitol over 2 years ago, standing with an Israeli flag, and the chap next to him is wearing a T-shirt saying 6 million was not enough. The State of Israel is incredibly close to Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister whose entire political philosophy is based on anti-Semitism, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who uses anti-Semitic imagery in every single election campaign. So what this tells us is if we actually analyze the way in which anti-Semitism is being weaponized for a far-right political agenda, in so doing, it has turned the world upside down. And finally, as an example, let me say, I have Jewish friends in Germany who have been beaten up by the German police because they are critical of Israel. This is a country that has led 2 genocides, that is enabling, arming, and facilitating a 3rd genocide, and it is allowing the agents of that state to attack Jews because of their political views as Jews. That is the state of the world in which we live today.
Something worth acknowledging and recognising is that while, yes, the time we are living in is shifting dangerously towards an extreme version of what we would call right-wing, politics in a very binary way of defining left-right politics, anti-Semitism is not exclusively a problem on the right. Yes, as you've just very strongly demonstrated, the identification of anti-Semitism among Labour groups was very clearly weaponized. And I think one of the biggest takeaways we have from today's episode is that, anti-Semitism is not your political weapon, wherever you stand. But of course, 21%, but there is evidence that, it is not necessarily just like a right-wing thing. 21% of the... I'm just going to read you, a figure from an EU survey, which basically said like a fifth of perpetrators of anti-Semitic harassment were described as left-wing by the recipients of this abuse. And at the peak of the anti-Semitism crisis in the UK Labour Party in 2019, 42% of British Jews said that they would seriously consider leaving the country if Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister at that time.
So when you look at those sort of figures, you've got to look at the methodology. That's what investigators do. And of course, there is anti-Semitism on the left.
Yeah, I think let's just address that because the media is very... the campaign
I want to say
weaponized.
something else about that. Okay, I have been politically active in the most racist state that had existed until that time in the post-World War II world, okay, in South Africa. And of course, I've seen various forms of racism on the left. But let me tell you something that is so blatantly obvious to anybody who has been engaged in politics for any length of time. The amount of racism, including anti-Semitism, that comes from the right is so much bigger than the racism you find on the left. And the reality is that, for instance, the scaremongering about the Labour Party and about Jeremy Corbyn was, to me, particularly ironic. Why? Because the EHRC decides to do a report specifically into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. That wasn't about anti-Semitism. That was about the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And the massive fear of the British establishment of Jeremy Corbyn, somebody who said he would suspend all British arms sales to non-democratic governments on the day he came into office. That's what terrifies people, okay? And the way in which the media projects what Jeremy Corbyn is. The LSE, the London School of Economics, did a survey that found that 74% of the statements that Jeremy Corbyn made during the 2017 election campaign were misrepresented by the media. 74%. So the point I'm trying to make is, let's not skew the narrative, and that what we need to look at is the real picture, not just in Britain but globally. And that picture, whether we like it or not, shows that political entities to the right of the political spectrum, and of course we're defining this in very normative terms, and especially political entities to the far right of the political spectrum, exhibit far, far greater instances of racism, including anti-Semitism.
But doesn't that whole discussion we just had, doesn't that point to the issue here, which is that as soon as anti-Semitism or any kind of racism is weaponized, as soon as the investigation to anti-Semitism is actually a political campaign, we stop talking about anti-Semitism. As soon as it becomes about politics...
No, we don't. Why do you say we stop talking about anti-Semitism? I get called on at least a weekly basis.
Wait, can we just take the tone down? Because I suppose I'm not in any way trying to undermine anything that you just said. I think that there's like a really universalizing issue that anyone listening, wherever their political views may be, something that they can take away from this is that we need to separate like politics. It isn't a political question, it's a human question, right? It's hate or not hate.
Question, but human questions are political questions, and I don't think one
hate is in all of us, right?
Of course
That's the enemy.
Of course it is. But the reality is that you can't separate issues of racism from issues of politics, because politics uses issues of racism. I would agree with you that when anti-Semitism is weaponized, the idea of anti-Semitism loses its meaning, because people define anti-Semitism as something to suit their political position. And what that does is it means anti-Semitism, which is very simple, hatred of Jews as Jews, which is where we started, loses its meaning. But to say we stop speaking about anti-Semitism, the reason that I respond to that is the opposite happens when we weaponize it. So, for instance, not a week goes by where on social media or in some event or broadcast that I'm doing, someone doesn't either call me a self-hating anti-Semitic Jew or describe my mother, because she survived the Holocaust, hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years and lost dozens of her family, mainly in Auschwitz, where I've lectured on genocide prevention. And I am called a self-hating anti-Semitic Jew, and they say, and your mother must have been a capo, which is a Nazi collaborator, if she survived. She was 7 years old in 1938 when Austria was occupied by the Nazis. And amongst other people, a rabbi made that statement on social media.
My God.
So it's not that we stop talking about anti-Semitism. It's that the weaponization of anti-Semitism is very, very dangerous for Jews as well. And unfortunately, our politicians, including my own MP, who should be defending Jews in his constituency, is actually part of the mob attacking Jews in his own constituency if we happen to have political views that are different to his. That is the state we are in. Now, when we think about what this all comes down to, I agree with you entirely. And what I appreciate about the fact that you've had this topic on today is because the weaponization of anti-Semitism undermines our ability to live in a non-racial world, to live in a world in which everybody is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. And this, to my mind, is the greatest struggle that we as humanity face right now, on a par with the climate catastrophe that our planet faces. This is the struggle that we have to do something about. And the way we do that is we don't allow this weaponization. When it takes place, we call it out ever louder. We don't allow fascism to rear its ugly head, and we treat every single human being, regardless of their political views, of their origins, of their religious views, or anything else, the way we want to be treated.
Andrew Feinstein, thank you for joining us. I think we can tell that Mandela was a mentor to you. And before we lose you, is there anything that you have to plug? Is there anywhere that listeners can follow you?
So I'm on all of the usual social media. For my sins, I have quite a big profile on X, but I'm also on Instagram and Blue Sky. I'm on Facebook, but I find it extremely difficult. I also can't figure out the photos on Instagram, so I'm a bit rubbish. But, and look at the work of my organization, Shadow World Investigations, at shadowworldinvestigations.org, because the world of militarism and the arms trade, unfortunately, has become so tied in to issues of politics, to issues of racism.